She handles the overnight walk-ins. My mother-in-law's voice carried across the room like smoke through a ventilation system, smooth and visible, filling every corner before you noticed the damage. You know how hospitals work. Someone has to take the 3 a.m. cuts and the slip and falls. That's where Regan fits in. She said my name like it was a footnote. 300 people in that ballroom. The annual fundraising gala for Pembroke Memorial's new cardiac wing. A $12 million project, 5 years in the making, and my mother-in-law had been on the planning committee since month 1. She'd spent that entire time preparing for tonight the way generals prepare for campaigns. Every seating arrangement considered, every introduction scripted, every compliment calibrated. She positioned herself at the center of the room in a navy Adriana Papel gown, hair set like armor, wearing the expression of a woman who had never once lost a social battle in her life. She turned to the man beside her, Dr. Frederick Harmon, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Northwestern, former president of the American College of Surgeons, a man whose name appeared in medical textbooks that I had studied in a cinder block apartment with a space heater that cut out every hour on the hour. She touched his arm the way you touch something you want other people to notice you touching. "Now this," she announced, voice lifting just enough for the nearest clusters of guests to turn, "is a man who represents true surgical excellence. Frederick, I've been telling this whole room about you for 6 months." Dr. Harmon smiled with the practiced ease of someone who'd received this kind of performance many times. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of distinguished that photographed well. He had no idea yet what she'd just done. Neither did I, until she finished the introduction, let a half-beat of theatrical silence pass, then tilted her head in my direction like an afterthought. "And that's my daughter-in-law." She didn't gesture, didn't say my name the second time, just that. A pronoun aimed at me the way you'd point at a piece of furniture. She works nights. Very dedicated. Her sister Marjorie laughed softly. My husband's cousin Braddock lifted his champagne glass in a small, private toast to no one. Across the table, my husband stared at the centerpiece with the particular focused blankness of a man who had made a lifelong practice of not noticing things he didn't want to address. I stood in the middle of that ballroom in my dark, structured blazer and pressed slacks. I didn't own ball gowns and had made my peace with that fact years ago, and I kept my breathing steady the way. I kept it steady in an operating room when everything was going wrong, and I was the only one in the room who couldn't show it. My right thumb pressed the edge of my phone in my jacket pocket. Habit. I'd started recording. I scanned the room. Marjorie, champagne already in hand at 7:45, leaning into the woman next to her and whispering something behind the rim of her glass. The same Marjorie who'd spent 3 Christmases telling anyone who'd listened that my husband had married beneath himself, that she'd told him so before the wedding. Braddock, the cousin, seated at the head table's outer edge because he'd donated $20,000 to the gala's silent auction, money from a trust fund he'd never done a single thing to earn. He had washed out of 2 business ventures and 1 law school application. He sat in a chair of honor because he shared their blood and their last name. And then there was my mother-in-law, returning her full attention to Dr. Harmon, already moving past me the way you move past a display you've already walked by. That's when Dr. Harmon's face changed. Not gradually, not politely. It broke open the way a diagnosis breaks open, sudden and total, the moment everything you thought you knew about a case rearranges itself into a different picture entirely. He was looking at me, not at my jacket, not past me, at me. His eyes moved from my face to the ID badge I still wore clipped to my lapel. Old habit from back-to-back shifts, I never remembered to take it off before events. And something behind his expression went from cordial to arrested, like a system switching modes. He said my name, my full name, not the abbreviated social version, the way you say it when you've said it before, somewhere else entirely, in a context that has nothing to do with a charity gala in Charlotte. "Dr. Regan Marsh." He paused. Then, in a voice low enough to be private but still audible to the 6 people closest to us, "Are you the 2%? My mother-in-law's glass stopped halfway to her lips. The nearest cluster of guests went quiet. Old Dr. Bellingham. He'd been a cardiothoracic fellow in the 70s, came to these galas every year, hearing aids and all, set down his fork. The clink of it against the china plate rang out in the sudden silence like a crack in ice. And my mother-in-law's smile died mid-breath. Before I tell you why those 3 words from one of the most decorated surgeons in this country dismantled everything my mother-in-law had spent years constructing, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Don't go anywhere, because what happened next, nobody in that room, including her, saw coming. The Pembroke Memorial Cardiac Care Gala, Charlotte, North Carolina. My mother-in-law had been on the planning committee since they first broke ground on the new wing. She'd co-chaired the fundraising drive, hosted the donor dinners, commissioned the commemorative program. This was her event in every sense that mattered to her. She'd chosen the venue, the centerpieces, the menu, and the arrangement of the featured tables. She had introduced Dr. Frederick Harmon, her personal philanthropic triumph, the man she'd persuaded to be the evening's guest speaker, as though she had personally sculpted him out of surgical steel. Then she'd turned to me. Not because she forgot I was there. My mother-in-law never forgot anything. She'd turned to me because she had spent 11 years building tonight as the venue where the version of me she'd been narrating to her social circle would finally be made official, public, permanent. The version went like this: my husband had married a woman from the wrong side of everything. No family connections, no old money, no debutante ball in her past. A girl from Dayton, Ohio, whose father drove a forklift at a machine parts facility off I-75, and whose mother worked the register at a Kroger on State Route 4 until her knees gave out. A girl who'd put herself through Ohio State on loans, and a Pell Grant and a job at the campus library that started at 4:45 in the morning. A girl who'd gone to medical school at Case Western on a combination of scholarships, more loans, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't photograph well at galas. A girl who worked nights. She'd refined this version over the years, testing it at dinner parties, and in phone calls with Marjorie, and in quiet asides at family gatherings where I was always positioned slightly outside the main circle. The version she'd settled on was the most effective. I was dedicated, bless my heart, but limited. I handled the overnight cases because that was the level I'd found. My husband, who practiced real estate law for a firm his father's college roommate had founded, was the family's achievement. I was the gap in the achievement narrative, carefully managed. She'd never said it as plainly as she said it tonight. Because tonight, she had Frederick Harmon. And Frederick Harmon, in her telling, was proof of what real medical excellence looked like. She'd been building to this contrast for 6 months. I stood still. My heart rate was probably 62. I'd checked it on my Apple Watch before I walked in the room, a habit left over from residency when I used to monitor myself during long cases the way pilots monitor fuel gauges. Not from anxiety, but because I needed the data. 62, same as always. Then I caught the shift in Dr. Harmon's face. The first time anyone called me, I was 31 years old, 14 hours into a shift, standing in scrubs that still had someone else's blood on the knee, eating a granola bar in the hallway of Dayton General's surgical unit because I hadn't had time to sit down since 6 that morning. Dayton General was not a prestige posting. It wasn't the kind of hospital that sent its residents to conferences or put its attendings' names on research grants. It was a safety net hospital on the north side of a mid-sized Midwestern city, and it took the cases that other hospitals in the region considered statistically inadvisable. When the survival odds on a trauma case dropped below a certain threshold, the paperwork started moving in a certain direction, and the family started receiving a certain kind of conversation. I had developed an unofficial policy about that particular conversation. I didn't have it until I'd done everything else first. My attendings during residency had split on this. 2 of them respected it. One told me I was burning myself out for cases that were already decided. I didn't argue with him, I just kept my case files. By the time I left Dayton General for my fellowship, I had 7 cases with documented survival odds under 2%, 7 patients who'd left the hospital breathing. The nursing staff started using the phrase first. I heard it in a handoff one night, one nurse to another, pointing at a chart, saying she's ours, it's a Regan case, it's basically a 2%, she'll stay. It wasn't official. It wasn't in any protocol. It spread the way things spread in hospitals, quietly, person to person, until it was just the word for that type of case, and I was just the name attached to it. I didn't know Dr. Frederick Harmon had heard it. I hadn't known he knew my name at all. The day I decided I would be a surgeon, I was 16 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of my father's pickup truck outside a Cincinnati hospital where my grandmother had just had a stent placed. It was February. The heat in the truck barely worked. My father had driven 3 hours round trip on his day off and spent 4 hours in a waiting room chair with a paperback he'd read twice before, and he hadn't complained once. On the drive home, he said, the doctor that put that thing in her, the one that came out and talked to us after, she knew exactly what she was doing. You could see it, steady, certain. He was quiet for a minute. The interstate was dark, and the truck's headlights threw long shadows on the pavement ahead. You could do that, he said. You know that, right? I was 16, I was failing pre-calc and working 12 hours a week at a gas station on Route 35 and had never known anyone personally who had gone to medical school. My father was a man who carried his lunch in the same blue cooler every day for 22 years, who took his vacation the second week of August because that was when the plant had its maintenance shutdown and he didn't have a choice, who had read every copy of National Geographic in the waiting room twice because the subscription had run out and nobody had refilled it. He said it the way he said things he was certain of, not as encouragement, as fact. You could do that. I kept those words the way you keep something small and load-bearing, tucked under the surface, in the place that doesn't show. He was gone before I started my residency, massive myocardial infarction, age 54, on the floor of the machine shop. The paramedics said he was gone before they arrived. A cardiac surgeon could not have saved him. The damage was too extensive, too fast. I know this because I've done the math 100 times in the years since, lying awake in post-call hotel rooms and quiet apartments, and once in the back of a call room while a snowstorm shut the hospital down and I had nothing to do but think. He did not see me become what he said I would be. That is the thing I have carried longest and hardest. Not my mother-in-law's contempt, not my husband's silence, not 11 years of family dinners where my name was a footnote. It was that. My father's voice in a cold pickup truck on a February interstate, saying you could do that, and not being there when I did. I keep a photograph of him in the inner pocket of every white coat I own, not displayed. Just there, something solid that has survived everything. The night I met Frederick Harmon, I was 27 years old, and he was the visiting attending for a surgical skills workshop at Case Western. He was not yet the president of anything. He was a 44-year-old surgeon with a reputation that had preceded him into the room by about 45 minutes. He was running a cadaver lab on a technique I'd been reading about for 6 months. I asked him 3 questions. He answered them, looked at me for a moment, and said, "What year are you?" "Third," I told him. He handed me a card. "Come find me when you're done." I called the number 2 years later when I was finishing residency. His office had changed, the number was different, I was rotating through 70-hour weeks, and eventually the residency ended, and I went to Dayton, and I didn't think much about it again. I had no idea he'd thought about it at all. Standing in a hospital gala ballroom 11 years later, watching his face rearrange itself in real time, I understood that something I had done, something I had not known, was visible outside the walls of one Northside Dayton hospital, had traveled much further than I'd meant it to. Dr. Regan Marsh, his voice was quiet, certain, the same tone he'd had in the cadaver lab at Case Western, the tone that meant he'd already processed the information and arrived at the answer and was simply confirming it aloud. "Are you the 2%?" My mother-in-law had no idea what the question meant. I could see it on her face, the half-second of pure blankness before her social instincts tried to kick in and she reached for a recovery. "Oh, Frederick, I'm sure whatever shorthand you surgical people use." He didn't hear her, or if he did, he didn't look at her. He was looking at me. If you've ever been invisible in a room full of people who should have seen you, if you've ever stood exactly where you belonged while someone who had no right to the narrative told it over your head, stay with me. Because what happened next took 11 years to arrive, and it arrived all at once. I saw the exact moment it finished processing for him. Dr. Harmon squared his shoulders, not the performance of it, not the theatrical version you see at podiums, the real one. The unconscious version, the posture a person's body assumes when it has just located something it's been looking for. "I've been trying to track you down for 4 years, he said. Marjorie had gone completely still. Braddock's champagne was resting on the table, forgotten. My husband, who had spent 11 years perfecting the art of not hearing things that complicated his life, had turned to look. Dr. Harmon addressed the room around him the way he probably addressed a room of residents. Matter of fact, unperformed, just information being placed accurately. 4 years ago, I sent a case to Dayton General that my team had assessed as non-viable. Blunt thoracic trauma, septal rupture, coagulopathy developing, survival odds we estimated at under 2%. My recommendation was comfort measures. The family refused transfer. Their attending was Dr. Regan Marsh. He let the silence hold for a moment. That patient attended my daughter's wedding last October. Nobody spoke. The woman to Marjorie's left had been a cardiothoracic nurse for 31 years. I didn't know that until she stood up. She didn't say anything. She just stood, slowly, deliberately, and looked at me with an expression I recognized because I'd seen it across operating tables at 4 in the morning. The expression of someone who understood exactly what survival odds, under 2%, meant in practice, what it cost to fight them, what it meant when you won. A man at the far end of the room stood a moment after, then a third person from the center cluster of tables, a fourth from the row near the window. No applause, no cheering, no sound at all except the soft scrape of chair legs on the marble floor and, somewhere near the back, the ventilation system cycling on. Every former medical professional in that ballroom rising from their seats, in a silence so absolute it pressed against the walls. This was the most expensive silence in that room's history, the kind that cannot be purchased or fabricated or inherited, the kind that says we see what you did, we know what it cost, and no one in this room has the authority to pretend otherwise. My mother-in-law's hand was gripping the back of a chair. Her knuckles had gone white. For the first time in 11 years, she had no more script. She tried once more. That was the thing about her. She'd spent so many years operating in rooms that moved the way she directed them that she didn't know how to stop the mechanism even when it was visibly failing. Well, her voice was still controlled just barely. Regan's always been dedicated. Certainly, night cases, weekends. Mrs. Pemberton Hall. Dr. Harmon's voice was very quiet, the particular kind of quiet that doesn't need volume because it has density. I've offered your daughter-in-law a position at Northwestern twice. She declined both times. I believe she said Charlotte was home. He looked at her steadily, the way you look at a set of findings that don't add up the way someone told you they would. Whatever you've been telling people about her practice, I'd suggest reconsidering your source. Marjorie's glass was on the table. Braddock was studying the floor with sudden absorption. My husband was looking at me, not at the centerpiece, not at the middle distance he'd cultivated for over a decade, at me, with something in his face that had come loose from wherever he'd kept it stored. Something that looked like it was arriving 11 years too late. I didn't move toward it. That would be a different story, and this one was already written. I picked up my clutch from the table, thanked Dr. Harmon, told him I'd return his call. Then I walked forward until I was standing directly in front of my mother-in-law, close enough that there was no angle of that room that cropped me out of the frame. I waited until she looked at me, the actual look, not the dismissive peripheral version she'd perfected over a decade. The real one, the one she couldn't redirect anywhere. The difference between your version of my life and my actual life is 11 years of evidence, I said. My voice was even, not loud. The patients who left that hospital when the family meeting said they shouldn't. That's not night shift work. That's not walk-ins and slip-and-falls. I let it settle. You've been telling a story about me in rooms I wasn't in, to people who trusted you more than they trusted their own eyes. That ends tonight, and I won't be attending events where I'm expected to stand still for it. I held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then I turned and walked through the rows of standing guests and out through the double doors without looking back. I drove to the cemetery off Brookshire Freeway an hour later. My father was buried there, in a plot he'd apparently selected himself, asking for something near the big oak tree at the north end of the grounds because he'd always liked working outdoors. It was after midnight when I arrived. I knew where the marker was. The cemetery was empty. Just me and the oak leaves and the sound of traffic somewhere distant on the interstate. I crouched at the headstone and pressed one bare hand flat against the cold granite. The stone was engraved simply, his name, his dates, and below that, at my request, a single line. He showed up. Every time. I got the hard cases, Dad, I said, not for sentiment, as a report. The way you deliver a report to someone who asked for it and waited for it and trusted that you'd find a way. 7 in Dayton, a few more here. The odds said no on every single one. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer, the photograph I always kept there, him at 51, standing in front of his truck in the plant parking lot, squinting into the afternoon sun, absolutely unconcerned with being photographed, the way he was unconcerned with most things that didn't have practical value. I propped it against the base of the headstone. I don't need to carry the whole weight of it anymore, I told him. You gave me the first part, the believing it part, the rest I built myself. I stood up, straightened my blazer, stayed at the grave for a long, unhurried moment, not performing the ceremony of it, but because he had spent a lifetime showing me that the people who matter deserve your actual time, not whatever is left over after everything else. This was the only place. I was not a night shift doctor, not the woman who married beneath the family name, not the footnote at the fundraiser. Here I was just his daughter, the one he drove 3 hours round trip in February to sit in a hospital waiting room for, the one he told, in a cold truck on a dark interstate, that she could do the thing she'd spent her whole life doing. I had done it. I turned and walked back through the wet grass to my car. The hospital called at 2:17. A transfer coming in from Concord, blunt abdominal trauma, hemodynamically unstable. The attending on call had already paged me as the preference. I took the call, turned the car around and headed north on I-77. There were things in my life that still needed to change. Conversations I was going to have, decisions that would be slow and hard and probably painful. But the thing my mother-in-law had spent 11 years trying to take from me, the record, the evidence, the accumulation of every 3 a.m. call answered, and every impossible case attempted, that was already done, already real, already outside the reach of anyone who hadn't been in the room to see it built. The road ahead was mine, not inherited, not given, built, case by case, in the dark, by a woman who learned from a man in a cold pickup truck that certainty doesn't require permission. Sometimes the only validation that lasts is the kind you produced when no one was watching. The kind that walks out of a hospital 4 years later, and stands up in a ballroom without warning, in a voice that carries wall to wall, and says, "I know exactly who she is." I pressed the accelerator. 14 minutes to Pembroke Memorial. I knew exactly what I was going to do when I got there.